You're listening to the PooleProof Wisdom Podcast, where we bring our authentic selves, refuse to raise grown folks, and share wisdom you can use. With your host, Charles K. Poole.
Hello, good people, and welcome to the podcast. Today we've got a bit of a weighty topic that it's time for again after it's fallen out of the headlines. Now, when reports of attacks against Asian and Pacific Islander people in America began peppering the airwaves months ago, then increased so quickly as to lead the newscast, I watched and listened so that I could better understand what was happening. As a black man, I'm used to hearing about attacks on black people. It's so commonplace that if it weren't for the fact that I'm a human being with a soul, I'd be desensitized to it, just like those who deny it's a real problem. But these reports, they were new, and the reasoning behind them, tied to lies about the origin of the coronavirus and what seemed a simmering hatred toward a people just because, made me wonder, what blight on humanity is this? It's also essential to mention that white Americans did not perpetrate these attacks alone. No, blacks and other ethnic groups seemed to gleefully join in the fray. I recall images of elderly people being unmercifully attacked and beaten, racial slurs being shouted at a family walking in a park, bricks being thrown and hitting a man walking down the street while minding his own business. When I saw these things, I teared up. It was some mix of hurt, disgust, and anger overtaking me. The same feelings when I saw someone who looks like me being attacked for being born in the skin they're in. But I also realized that I had been walking around with my head in the sand. I'd forgotten how Asian people had been treated in America before, and somehow had concluded things were different because that was in the past. It's the first mistake anyone makes when looking at anyone else's life only through the lens of their own experience. And it is a big mistake. In its most recent national report, issued in August and representing incidents through June, Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate, an organization formed after an alarming escalation in xenophobia and bigotry against Asian and Pacific Islander people in the U.S., reported that the number of incidents reported to its center increased to 9,081 from 6,603 between April and June of this year. Of all incidents, 4,548 hate incidents occurred in 2020, and 4,533 incidents of hate happened in 2021. Now, these attacks range from physical assault to verbal harassment to online harassment to even civil rights violations. And while some may want to blow off the numbers as small, let's just call a thing and keep in mind that those are reported incidents. Imagine how many incidents go unreported, and perhaps you'll understand why this growth in attacks is something everyone should be concerned about, no matter what they look like or where they come from. My guest today, David L. Kim, is president and CEO of the IAMBIC Group, LLC, a marketing and public affairs consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. He creates and facilitates the implementation of reputation management, multicultural marketing, strategic communications, and community relations strategies for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, nonprofit, and international organizations. Prior to joining the IAMBIC Group, David was Vice President of Multicultural Markets and Engagements at AARP, where he developed and managed the first ever integrated marketing strategy that generated an increase in lifetime and multi-year memberships among Asian members that was the highest of all multicultural groups combined. Now, David also served under President George W. Bush when he was appointed Chief of Staff at the United States Mint, and before that, I knew David when we worked together at Anheuser-Busch, where he led Asian marketing and community relations, both domestic and international, at the company. During his 15-year career at Anheuser-Busch, he was responsible for managing and growing sales in the Asian market, which was then the fourth largest retail channel, worth over $250 million annually. but it was his advocacy, diversity, and inclusion counseling, and committed efforts to educate and inform businesses and communities about the breadth and uniqueness of Asian communities that both influenced and inspired me to reach out to him to join me for this discussion today. David serves on several national corporate and nonprofit boards, including the Board of Advisors for Duke University Libraries. He also currently serves as the managing member of the Multicultural Marketing Advisory Board for Diageo. He graduated from Duke University with a bachelor's degree in political science and attended Columbia University Graduate School of International and Public Affairs, and he has a wealth of perspective and experience that I know he'll bless us with today. Good afternoon, David, and welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you could join us today. Are you ready for a really scintillating conversation?
Yes, I am. Charles, thank you so much for having me on. I think that one thing that I've come to appreciate working with you when we were at Anheuser-Busch was your depth of intellectual curiosity, your willingness not to accept things just simply the way they appeared. And we've had some great conversations in the past. And so I welcome this time in 2021, years later, where we could kind of talk about some great issues in a very, very different world.
Yeah. Well, I have always exactly had that same reaction. And I always appreciate it with you. It reminds me of something that my mama used to say about people when they thought they understood someone but really didn't know. And she would say, "Child, if you knew what was going on in my head, it would bust your head clean open." And working at Anheuser-Busch during the time that we did, we saw some interesting things together. And I think we could always tell that we were both able to be very clear on when it was a lot of BS. And you had your facial expression, I had mine, but I think we always knew the same of each other. So I totally appreciate that. And that's too, why I wanted to speak with you, because you are candid, but you're also astute. And you also understand things from a perspective that, of course, I can. I have my experience, and I can certainly incorporate other experiences into that. But I never like to be that person who assumes that I can step into another person's shoes. I can only understand what they are going through, and that's what the nature of this conversation is. Okay, so months ago, this started to happen. There would be news reports that popped up, a few at first and then more and more, where there were people who were of what were categorized as Asian and Pacific Islander extraction who were being attacked for no apparent reason. But when the questions began to arise, it became clear that there were some people who had concluded that these lies about the origin of the coronavirus or, any number of other things that they wanted to do were somehow associated with these groups. And their only reaction, as opposed to a conversation, was to attack. For me, it took a little while for that to resonate because I wasn't quite getting it. But from your perspective, when this started to happen, tell me about your reaction, because I assume that it wasn't possibly new to you as it was to us. So tell me about that.
Well, Charles, sadly, this was not a surprise. Unfortunately, if we look back in history, and one good example, if you look at some of the cartoons in the newspapers and in the print media during World War II, you found a lot of caricatures of Asian people. Why? Because America was fighting a war against Japan. And the number of wars that America has fought against Asian countries has really been sort of in the back of a lot of people's minds as to what their view is of those countries, the people, the stereotypes, and the fact that they're here in the United States. I will say, Charles, that what we have witnessed recently that initially was about sort of Chinese folks, because that's where COVID has been associated with, is not going to be the end of it, unfortunately, because there is another country out there where potentially we may go to war with, and that is North Korea, in which case the next chapter will be Korean bashing. And the fact is, they will say, "Are you from Korea?" And they will say North Korea, South Korea. They won't know the difference but Koreans may be, demonized as well because of what little is known about Kim Jong-un and that whole dictatorship and that. So I think that, long story short, there's been a historical ignorance about people of color in general, throughout the years, whether it's African Americans, whether it's Asian Americans, whether it's Arabs and Muslims after 9/11, anybody who's not European or white is going to be susceptible. Even the Native Americans, which is the worst irony of all, because they were here first. So I think that's a huge area of contention that's driven by ignorance, fanned by the flames of the media, and unfortunately is a fight that we all need to kind of understand. Now, the one thing though that I think that is important to understand is that it has brought a lot of us together because we're now having shared experiences. And you mentioned at the beginning of the show, Charles, that you're used to hearing and seeing men and women, or men, women, and children, unfortunately, being abused, beaten in the American public. And many of the, say Asian community really looked at that and said, oh, wow, that's a shame, and didn't really pay much attention. Now all of a sudden, oh my goodness, it's happening to us. It's happening to our elders. And it has created a sense of, well, look, if you're not white, it can happen to anybody. So, in the good sense, wake up and realize that we're all in this together. And that it has created an urgency of allyship, in that we need to learn just as much about the history of Blacks and African Americans in the United States, and appreciate that, because quite honestly, a lot of the sort of the freedoms and a lot of the things that people of other ethnicities and races are able to enjoy today comes at the heels of the suffering of what happened to African Americans. And so there is a silver lining to this dark cloud, but nonetheless, it is something that it still needs to be combated today.
So that for me brings up an important question. I'm a person who believes in the human race, and that's pretty much all there is. And for me, I realize at the same time that groups that may have suffered any form of oppression, or whatever we want to call it, they suffer it and they deal with it in a kind of insular way. And to your point, they don't look at it from the perspective of others. And I've always wondered personally why those people wouldn't necessarily say, we're all at risk here. Let's work together to try to make sure none of us are. Do you have a take on that from your perspective?
Yes, I do. And it may not be the right one, but it's the one I have. And,
Sure.
and I think that you would probably agree to a certain degree. And that is, unfortunately, everything becomes politically tinged, right? There's something to be gained, some money to be made. There are personal agendas. It's not as pure, unfortunately. And that's where things get a little bit muddy, where if it's framed in a zero-sum situation. And so let me use an example. The Japanese Americans who were interned, 120,000 of them were sent to concentration camps by President Franklin Roosevelt, and only years later was there sort of reparations paid. And quite frankly, most of the people had passed and whatnot. Well, we hear in the news today things about the 1619 Project, reparations for slavery. It's a very interesting issue, and I don't claim to have the answer to it. But it's interesting that it is an issue that has not been universally embraced by all African Americans, because there are those that have said, look, yes, it is wrong, but then that was then, this is now. It gets kind of convoluted as to trying to implement sort of a tax where you have people that are recent immigrants and are saying, I understand the history. I appreciate it. I can do what I can, but I'm being asked to pay for something that I wasn't even in the country for. That I don't understand. Explain it to me. And that has value.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that to answer your question again, the idea that people could come together through shared experience and make this a better country should be absolutely front and center. To resist kind of the political machinations to kind of pit minorities against each other in some way ought to be as studiously avoided as possible, despite the fact that there are going to be political personal agendas that will come into play on this.
Yeah.
And that's all I can say about it.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think the politicization of it, and of course the economic tie-in to that, is unforgivable, quite honestly, because everything is not about the issue, the dark, negligent issue of coin. I think that when we're looking at these types of circumstances, it comes down to getting to understand who people are. You know, it's interesting to me, people have this perceived hatred of what they call stereotypes, but at the same time, they give in to them as it relates to perspectives of another group of people. When I encounter that, I'm always trying to blow up the stereotype. I'm also equally aware that there are things that you have to look at and say, well, okay, that may be true. Let me find out if it is by having an exploration with someone who understands the culture. Because if somebody asks me a question about something, yeah, I'm black. Well, I do like fried chicken. Okay? I do eat watermelon. Ain't nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, the symbolic nature that we have seems to apply to things like that, words that are used and all of that, which personally, I know that it resonates differently with other people. You can call me everything. I've been called everything but a child of God. I don't care, okay? So I'm not going to get too bent out of shape by you calling me a name. It just doesn't matter. But then we don't invest the same degree of interest and passion into actually attacking the problems. And therefore, if I am talking to you and you're talking to me, that's the start of something worthwhile, because we're beginning to see each other from our perspective versus saying, well, this is what I understand about this group of people, and this is what I understand about this group of people, and therefore, that's all I need to know. So these types of conversations, David, how do we get them started? And I'm not talking to you as if you have, again, the answers to everything. But just from your perspective, if you are trying to branch out to work with people who are different from yourself, how do you get started?
That's a great question, Charles. And I think one of the first things that needs to continue and has finally started is for Americans of Asian descent to be less invisible statistically. So every time you pick up USA Today, they have a little poll in the bottom, and it's a pie chart or a bar chart, and says, you know, this number of African Americans or blacks and this number of percentage of Hispanics think about this issue or vote for this party or whatnot. And then there's nothing about Asians. Mm-hmm. That's, believe it or not that I'm the type of guy that uses this term, you know, often or at all, but I can certainly say that's a form of institutional racism, mm-hmm. because not even being in the room, not even being on the page means that you don't exist. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really huge, because finally you have some efforts being made to collect data. And it was prompted in part, quite honestly, by the anti-hate violence that has been going on, that people were scrambling around for statistics, that crimes against Asians, the things that we have seen visually, depicted, where people are being knocked down, people are being, shoved downstairs, what have you. People began to start asking questions. Well, how many times has this happened? Where has this happened? And I think those important questions have finally prompted kind of a new effort to start to collect data and baseline some of this. So I think that's really an important part to even begin a conversation, because otherwise you can't even say that this issue is worse than it was last year if you don't have a baseline. Mm-hmm. Now, given what I just said, the numbers that are out there that we all see are, triple digit, 300, 400, 500% over last year. And that's to be taken, sort of, you got to take that, in consideration, the fact that there was maybe poor or non-existent reporting. So everything that reported this year is going to be a significant spike. But, keeping that in perspective, the fact that it's starting to happen is important. And this goes along with other statistics as well that are, that impact resources, whether it's, I don't know, whether it's money that's being given for social service programming, whether it's money that's being, put together for small business loans. Without statistics about Americans of Asian descent, they don't get any. There's no chance to apply for any. And I think that's a key thing to begin the conversation.
So, I was reading an article, and it was from a San Francisco newspaper, and the journalist was, I believe she said that she was Korean and, was familiar with the community there. And she says there's this perception that if you are of Asian, extraction, that you keep your, that culturally you keep your head down, you don't say too much, you try not to make a big deal out of everything. And now this is a time where if that is in any way true, it's time to stop. Do you find in your experience that that's been part of it, as well as that there's been a lack of interest in making a big deal about it, or is it something else?
Charles, another great question. It has less to do with interest, an issue of interest. It's a lack of trust. So, and it's a bit of fear. So let's talk about corporately. If I had your courage, Charles, I would have either been promoted or I would have been fired very quickly at AB.
I understand. Trust me.
Exactly. So it comes in many forms, and it depends in the context in which it's at. But now I think things have changed, and it's interesting that things have started to be mainstreamed a bit. So here's an example. As I watched a lot of the looting and burning and the rioting going on in Minneapolis, there were, and I was shocked because they actually interviewed some Black store owners in Minneapolis who were absolutely just pissed that their stores were targeted. It's like, why would you target us? We're not the enemy, right? And in fact, one of them said, we got to do what the Koreans did in the LA riots. Arm up. And I thought, wow. So there is something there that transcends race, to your point of everybody's a human in that, and that these Black store owners understood that riffraff comes in all shapes, sizes, and colors, and the fact that these folks don't respect anything and that they're willing to come after, quote, even Black store owners, obviously indicates that you're dealing with somebody who's, it's just illogical. It doesn't make sense in that regard. And that goes back to my comment of shared experiences, where you're going to have Black store owners come together with Asian or Korean store owners, because in order to run a successful business, in order to feed their families, in order to possibly give their kids their system of something of legacy, that's a common, there's some shared values in it. Nobody likes shoplifters, regardless of race, color, ethnicity. So there is areas of where people come together, and I'll make one last comment too about that is the one thing that really dismays me about America is the fact that everything has become sort of so polarized that the idea that there could be Black Republicans has become so abhorrent to society. I just shake my head, and the fact that why does everybody have to be in lockstep with what, one particular party dictates or something? I said, that's not what America is all about. And shame on us if we don't protect the freedom of people to express their own ideas in that regard, you know?
Yeah. It really goes back to two categories for me: our love of symbolism and our love of labels. I abhor both. I don't like symbolism because it doesn't necessarily have meaning. And I certainly don't like labels because that's what other people use when they don't know who the other person really is. I'm always the first person, for instance, it's a small scale thing, but it's something I stand up for. You'll introduce yourself to someone. You said, "Hi, my name's Charles." And within 2 seconds, they're like, "So Chuck." And I will
Oh,
stop and say, "Excuse me, that is not my name." Now, I don't know what your intent was, nor do I care, but I've told you my name. That's the reason I want you to use it. Conversely, if we're looking at it from your perspective, we can all compare notes, things that you've dealt with, things I've dealt with. I'm always talking about the fact that back when I had hair, people would like to touch it. Okay, or asking me obtuse questions. I know that there have been things too. One of my friends, I don't know if you remember her, she used to work at Anheuser-Busch as well, but she's Asian, and she used to always say that people ask her, "What kind of Asian are you?"
that's right. That's
So
right.
it's this tendency to not immerse ourselves in a pursuit of understanding, but in symbolism and labels that gets us in so much trouble. So that point about the political nature of it, yeah, that's a really big thing. I don't counter to either of those. I'm like people, out here in California now, they're like, what party do you belong to on the ballot? And I have to just go down and select the other because I'm like,
Yeah,
I'm a party of Charles. Thank you very much.
that's right.
And I vote for what makes sense to me. But when we're looking in that kind of thinking in this large context, this reminds me that we have got this major challenge here where we have an idea that there's this community. When people refer to the, Asian American Pacific Islander community, again, making it monolithic, or the black community, that automatically sets us up to believe that if we do something, that the other group is going to be somehow upset by it because they're not getting their share of the pie as well. To get beyond that thinking in terms of the politics and whatnot, what do we do? Because you've worked in this area. What do we do to get politicians who fall into those categories of party to actually pay attention to what the people want for a change? Any weigh in on that?
Well, let me kind of answer the question this way, Charles. So what I'm doing now currently is I'm the interim executive director of Korean Americans for Political Action.
Mm,
And it is a 501c4 nonpartisan, nonprofit membership-based organization. And what we do is based around what I call the three I's. Number one is identify
mm,
Korean Americans who are running for office and work with them to support them to get elected to local, state, or congressional office. The second I is initiate legislation that will be beneficial to Korean Americans or defeat legislation that will be detrimental to Korean Americans. And three, increase the awareness of contributions made by Korean Americans to American society.
mm-hmm,
So if we use, for example, what the Jewish folks have done in their model, and they have a very powerful organization called AIPAC,
mm,
um, what we're trying to do is philosophically very similar, and that is, for example, look at the number of Korean American voters in a particular voting district and compare the margin of victory with the number of voters and see if that is a point of leverage, so that the candidate or the incumbent running for office pays attention to what are the issues that are important to Korean Americans.
mm-hmm.
To understand Korean Americans, to actually come out to a Korean community dinner or a community event, which was, that brings people together. So there is some sense of familiarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because much in the way that you have greatly pointed out, how some people assume that they can call you anything but Charles when you just told them that, you can imagine how
Mm-hmm.
they kind of mangle Korean names of people, and well, they say, well, what's your real name or what's your American name? And it's
Right.
like, no, this is my name,
Mm-hmm.
in that regard. So that is, I think, some of the things that we can do to get people to kind of take notice. The other thing that I think would be interesting to let everybody know is that there's now a movement where legislators are passing bills to include ethnic and or Asian American history as part of the K through 12 curriculum. That you need to understand and learn about certain things about the rest of the non-white people in the United States before you graduate. I think that's a positive thing. That is huge, because that can only help people better understand, have a different frame of reference when they meet someone who's not white or who doesn't look like them. And I think that in the end is, well, I shouldn't say in the end, but I think that's the very beginning of developing generations of kids who will be more open, less sort of prejudicial and biased by the media, because they've had a chance to either go to school, eat lunch with, work with people who do not look like them, and have come to appreciate that.
That's a really important point. I'm at a loss to understand what folks' fear is about understanding or accepting, and particularly teaching, a history other than their own. I don't even have words for it, David. It's just like, what's the problem? Books being banned because of certain things, and, behaviors not being necessarily embraced because they are outside the realm of what someone's comfortable with. And this country, going back a little bit too about this whole issue about how we come together, I think that there is truth, and I think that there is strength in knowing what your past has been so that you can learn from it. Otherwise, you keep making the same freaking mistake over and over again with no reason to understand anything. So when we flash forward and people look at circumstances and they are shocked, and they always say, well, I can't believe this is happening. It's 2021. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, it is, but not everybody thinks that's when it is, because a lot of people still hold perceptions that there is a right way for the world to be, and it excludes a whole lot of people. I've used it before that there's an old saying that if you have any faith or whatever your faith system may be, you believe that there is a creator of everything. But interestingly, we humans then decide which ones are the right ones, right? So this idea that we need to come together is a wonderful one. It's a kumbaya moment, as I like to call it. But the work is hard to do, because while we can talk about things like the educational models and that type of thing, we then come up against groups within the overall group that is trying to get this pushed, that then dictate, well, this is the history we want to have taught, not that history. We don't want that. It's like this show that's on television now called Our Kind of People. So you may have Korean people, I've got black people who are like, well, no, we're not going to talk about that. So let's talk about the truth within our own communities as they exist. How do you fight that battle, my friend? Because it's not easy, and I know it's not the stuff you're supposed to say, because it's supposedly airing our dirty laundry, but the number of people who are like us, who are standing in the way of mutual progress, it's higher than most people would think. So I'm sure in the roles that you've served and the ones you're serving in, it's got to be a challenge.
I can give you a very good example, Charles. I would say that the percentage may have gone down a little bit, but easily close to 70% of the Americans who are of Korean descent were born in Korea, or immigrants. So the number of the percentage of second generation is a lot smaller. Because of that, there are some stereotypes of other races, black especially, for example, that are painful and outdated, antiquated. But it's really strange. It's born out of Koreans who were in Korea and encountered black people for the first time there, or watched TV and TV shows, saw how blacks were portrayed in American TV shows. And obviously that's not a great thing, right? If you've never met a black person and the only thing you've known about is the news reports or whatnot, your bias of what black people are going to be,
sure,
not, is going to be horrible.
What you see is what you know.
Yes,
Right,
incomplete.
right.
So not too long ago, a former congressman, the first ever Korean American congressman named Jay Kim, made a comment um, that disparaged one of the recently elected Korean American members of Congress, Marilyn Strickland, whose mother is Korean, but whose father is Black. We immediately issued a press release to condemn that, because that is not reflective of all Koreans, as hardly. And for him to have voiced that is both sad and needs to be called out. As you said, we do not want anybody to ever think that just because he's a former congressman, that somehow his opinion reflects the opinion of all people. Secondly, the interesting in the Korean American community is that Korean Americans are, even as a singular group, have become monolithic. Why? Because there are at least about 100,000 adoptees that you would never know are Korean, because their name could be Charles Poole.
Exactly.
Or they are half. Their mother or father is Korean. I mean, no one would ever know that. And so that has been a great opportunity to really expand the tent of what it means to be Korean American. And
Right.
many people are curious. And I was very curious. And when I first talked with Congresswoman Strickland, I asked her, I said, so Congresswoman Strickland, your mother's Korean, your father's Black. How do you answer the question when people ask you, do you feel that you're Korean? Or how Korean are you? And she gave the most wonderful answer that I think transcends race because of what she said. And she said, listen, David, anybody who's raised by a Korean mother is Korean. And once she said that, I said, Marilyn, you got me.
Exactly.
I got it. I got it. I love the fact that she respects, understands both sort of cultures, if you will. And she has given examples where she has corrected people on both sides, where she went to graduate school at Clark University, and she overheard some classmates, not knowing that she was part Korean, say something sort of derogatory about Koreans. And she said, no, I'm Korean, I'm half Korean. That's not true. So you need to know better, much in the way that she has also talked to the Korean folks in her state and said, I'm half Korean. This is what you need to understand about the Black community as well. So I think people like that, people who understand that, are really a great hope for America in general, and communities of people coming together in that regard.
And I think that, it's important to add on to that, and thank you for sharing it, because I think that we tend to forget that real movements begin with individual people who join together. It's not like some huge coalition happens and then all of a sudden the world just changes. One person at a time makes a difference. I it's interesting because within every group of people, there are people who are trying to strive for the good, and then there are people who are not. It's kind of like the argument I've had with people when we talk about, police. I worked at a police department. There were some good people there. There are some horrible ones too. But you name any faction, any group, any place in the world where you don't find that dynamic at play. That's just the way it is. I, recently moved. I hate that it's called this because it just seems weird at this day and age to be doing this. But here in Los Angeles, they have, of course, the area called Koreatown. So I moved to that area. But there's a person in the building who is Chinese who is always talking negatively about Korean people. So I think that the person thinks they can do that because I look like I look. So what I say is, you can have that opinion, but you can't share it with me, right? That's my putting my feet in the sand and saying, you're not going to get to carry this narrative forward. And I think across the world, and particularly in this country, that's where it begins. This one person at a time standing up and saying, I will not allow you to disparage these people or this person in my presence, because that's the only way the infection can be stopped, right? Is if people stop allowing it to infect them, and then they carry it off to someone else, and then says my favorite thing in the world when people get caught doing their dirty shit. Oh, I was just joking. Well, you know what, mofo? It wasn't
Yes,
funny. So don't make that joke anymore, right?
that's right. That's right. That's
Right.
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 You-
So when you hear that, and you said that you're hopeful about, this type of person being the one who's going to lead the charge, we hear so much about the negativity because of the media, as you mentioned, but the good news, the work that you're doing, that others are doing, the people who are out here on the front lines trying to make sure that truth rises higher than the fiction. How can we tap into that more broadly so that we can stop the hate? And I know it's a historic question because we've been dealing this for a long time, but all we can do is what we can do now. So tell me about that from where you sit today and how you think it can be used.
We, let me go back to part of my work at CAPA, and when we identify, potential candidates running for office, you can imagine that the number of American candidates of Korean descent who are running in districts that are not Korean or Asian dominant in terms of constituents is pretty significant.
Mm-hmm.
And let me give another great example. A state house member, Patty Kim, her district is primarily Black.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that she got elected, a Korean American woman getting elected in a Black district, says something.
Mm-hmm.
She obviously has gained their trust
Right.
as a person who represents them regardless. Well, I shouldn't say regardless, but the fact that she's not Black, it busts up the myth that only Blacks can win in Black districts, Korean can run in Korean districts, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a positive sign.
Mm-hmm.
That we need to identify more of these people because they obviously are giving voice to the concerns, the issues. They're seeking solutions to helping the people in their district who happen to be Black.
Right. Right.
And so I think that's really key. And the more that this comes out, the more that we see people who are supporting these candidates who not necessarily have the same race or ethnicity and vice versa. I think that's one of the things that we love seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, if it was only Koreans running in Korean districts, we'd only have maybe 5 or 6 candidates in the whole country.
Yeah.
And that's
yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, David, I think that it begs us to sit up and pay attention to a real truth, which is that line from Dr. King about the content of someone's character. It will never be timeless. It will forever be timeless. God, what was I saying? It will forever be timeless, and it will never lose its meaning, simply because if we get to the point where, going back to something that was stated earlier, we're looking at each other as fellow humans, then it doesn't become as necessary to break off into these individual factions so that politically we can say, well, now we're doing this because this group represents our interests. It boggles the mind how people can live in the same country and think that they are all supposed to have different needs served consistently without there being a collective need that has to be served first.
Exactly.
That's what boggles the mind. So that example you gave, that's what I want to see, because I think that's where not only there are financial and social rewards, but this thing about this hate, when people can stop objectifying people as the type of individual who deserves to be hated or the type of person who has the right to hate, that's when we break down all of the walls. How do you feel about that?
Charles, you're typically eloquent. Obviously, we just got to keep the media out of it because they have a mission, and that is to make money. And the only way to make money is to sensationalize things and take it out of context. And unfortunately, that really kind of really muddies up the ability to understand at a human level these things. I think I've been watching, for example, the comparison of the refugees from Afghanistan coming over and the refugees from Haiti, right? Two very, very different situations, and how the media is treating them, which shapes how America looks at them. And the question is, which is right, which is wrong, and try to understand the real sort of issues behind it. So I think that's one of the things. I think the other thing that has helped has been another factor, quite honestly, Charles, and that is a different world in terms of consumerism. So America got used to the importing of cars and appliances from Japan, starting with Honda, Toyota, and they had Panasonic and Sony. Well, now the wave is Hyundai cars and Kia cars and Samsung cell phones and LG washers and whatnot. And then you have the movie Parasite winning an Oscar, going, oh my God, a Korean movie winning an Oscar. I think that is helping to kind of create a more fertile environment for a more honest curiosity. And the ability for people to kind of ask the right questions, or at least to be aware of that. And then on top of that, when you have someone like Sunny Lee winning the gold medal at the Olympics and people scrambling to find out who she is, and she's a Hmong? No, it's called Hmong.
Right.
And where are they from? Minnesota. And what? They were from Laos, and they fought with the Americans in Vietnam War. They don't have a written language. Oh my gosh, maybe I got to see the movie Gran Torino that Clint Eastwood did that was groundbreaking and nobody paid attention to it. It creates a better wealth of knowledge and curiosity in that. And I think the more that happens, I think that it's beneficial. I mean, it doesn't hurt that, Sunny Lee and before her, Chloe Kim, who won the snowboarding gold at the Olympics, 17-year-old kid, and, was like, oh my God. And it makes us proud they're representing the United States. I think that's one moment, I guess, where people suspend their willingness to be either biased, prejudicial, whatnot, as long as it's done in the name of US, and then they begrudgingly say, well, gosh, they got us a gold medal. And people get ferocious about anything that takes away the nationalist pride. And that's about the one moment I can say that people will hold off a bit, as long as they represent the U.S. and bring home a gold medal.
Right. Well, I happen to agree with you, and I think too. Speaking about media representation, I always tell people I'm a recovering journalist. Is what I studied in college, and it was different then, though. It was so much different. And two things that I just want to speak to in terms of the media that gets back to what I like to call the soul of a people. And, number one, in terms of journalism, I'll never forget what Clinton's former press secretary, one of the best ones, by the way, said. Dee Dee Myers always said that the approach that she understood was good news is no news, so the media tends to create conflict. Very true. But the other side of that is, since the media is a business and it's driven by viewership and advertising and what have you, what we do know about the media is that they literally are serving up what people are asking for. And the way I know that is that now that we have, boggles the mind again, these people called citizen journalists out with an iPhone or whatever phone they've got recording things. We've all seen the episodes where people have been there recording with their phone while someone is being beaten to death and they don't intercede. They put it out there. What people will record their own suicides on these live versions of these apps, and people don't try to call for help. They sit there and watch. The media can only dispense what people are willing to allow. And when we are in a place where we are willing to allow this to perpetuate how we are as humans, it's no wonder people think it's okay to watch someone getting beaten or someone being killed. So that's the one thing I would add to it. I don't disagree about the media's role because they should be questioning why they're allowing this to become the new dynamic of how they report. But it still gets back to people. which is what's in your soul, what's in your heart that convinces you this is okay. And when you come to an element such as looking at someone because they look a certain way or subscribe to a different cultural perspective and saying, well, I don't care if there are facts or not, I believe this and I'm going to attack you for it, something's wrong. And that's the core issue that I think we all have to get to. Yeah?
Absolutely. And you're right. And there's no doubt that the last administration, unfortunately, the amount of rhetoric, toxic rhetoric, I will add, gave permission for people to act out. And that was inexcusable.
Yeah.
I mean, we already have enough issues as it is, but to have that stuff ramped up, and especially on a stage where it was so widespread, was absolutely appalling. No doubt about it. So you're correct in the sense, and I share your total sort of disgust, if you will, of people who are watching someone getting beaten and just filming it,
Right.
instead of interceding and trying at a human level to save, stop, or what have you, stop it from happening. I mean, that I agree with you. I can't understand why that doesn't happen,
Right.
other than, there's just something wrong that's going on. And if it's in fact, some sort of indication of where we are as a society, God help us.
Right. Right.
So,
Well, as you've thoughtfully brought up during the course of this conversation, it is the foundational elements of what we're teaching our young people, what we're willing to learn ourselves, how we are educating people. And I mean in all factors that there possibly can exist. Because education isn't something you just get in school. It's about just reaching out and understanding things. I'll ask people all the time, questions because I really want to know. I'm hungry for that knowledge because it helps me to understand my place in the world as well. So this idea of stopping Asian American Pacific Islander hate, while of course it's come to the forefront now and it has been in the headlines for a while, it's really the same issue as it has been throughout history for any groups of people who have been attacked or, abused in any way, which is to understand the right of others to exist, to believe as they believe, to choose as they choose, and not to blame them for things that are not their fault. It's really that simple, isn't it?
yes, absolutely. If I had the answers, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be probably. But you're absolutely right, Charles. And what I appreciate most about talking with you is being able to give voice to, some of the thinking behind what we can do to change going forward. What do we need to do more of, in order to kind of sort of like, how can we water the forest to prevent the next, little flame become a raging fire that burns down half of the forest? That will continue to be, the age-old question. But the fact that we're talking about it now, the fact that hopefully the listeners to this podcast will take note and look within themselves to see what they can do, and be aware of this, I think is incredibly important and incredibly valuable.
I think we're going to be getting ready to wrap up here, and I will summarize by saying this as a result of this wonderful conversation we've had. If each one chooses to be one, meaning a good person, we can literally change the world. And that power resonates and resides in every person who makes the choice to simply give into the idea that all humans have a right to exist on this planet. That's the reason we're all here. Nobody put us here by mistake. But we also have to learn, and I know this may be too touchy-feely for certain people, we all have to learn how to really love one another. Really. And I do mean that because the only thing that counterbalances hate is love. And I happen to believe that there are more people on the planet who actually do that than we hear about. We need to be telling their stories. We need to be sharing those experiences, and we need to embody it ourselves in every interaction at every opportunity we have. As we get ready to close, tell me how going forward you will continue to do that, because you're already doing it, and what you would encourage others to do as well.
First thing is to remember never underestimate happiness.
Mm.
That is something that is, and maybe in my old age, so to speak, I've finally come to that sort of conclusion that it is such an amazing feeling that you don't want it to end. You want to repeat it. You want to share it. You want to create situations where more happiness is created. And I think that by keeping that in mind, and in conjunction with your comment about the importance of love, it is, life is too short.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately we get too old before we realize that, but hearing younger people hearing this should understand that, as anxious as they are, especially in this pandemic world that we're in, to stop and take a moment and value and do the things, meet the people, and just create things that are based out of love, that promote happiness, your own as well as the happiness of others. It just leads to a healthier and better life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to your point, that's what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
For the time that we're here on earth, why waste it on negativity, anger, bitterness? It's just, it's energy sucking. And at the end, you're still dissatisfied.
Mm-hmm. And that, David, is what I like to call a word. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. You have given us so much to think about and so much to consider, and I really want to thank you for the time today.
Thank you for having me, Charles, my friend. Hope to see you in person before too long.
I would go for that.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the PooleProof Wisdom Podcast. We always enjoy the company. Be sure to listen, like, subscribe, and share using Google and Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, Anchor, Overcast, YouTube, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this episode, we'd appreciate it very much if you simply tell a friend about the podcast too. Spread the word. Until next time, keep on living.